This is Fontainhas in Goa. This is also called the Old Latin Quarter or the Portuguese Quarter of Goa, and we'll try to explore it today. As you can already sense, Fontainhas is a very colorful part of Goa. This is not the usual Goa that you would see. There's no beach around here, of course. And this building that's coming to our right, it's actually a very famous church of this area. Or technically speaking, it's actually a chapel. It's Saint Sebastian Chapel. As you can see, it's a bit of a tourist attraction here. You'll notice that usually all the buildings of this area, of this Latin Quarter of Goa, they're very colorful, but of course the chapel has to stand out, so it's in its iconic white color. No prizes for guessing what or who Saint Sebastian Chapel is named after. It's the famous European saint called Saint Sebastian. He was also believed to be the saint who would cure you of your illnesses, and that was one reason why at the time of plague this church was built here. The road is named after Saint Sebastian as well. And this is the other crossroad having its Portuguese name, as you see there. So there's a history to those beautiful tiles that you saw as well, the white and blue tiles. They're actually of Portuguese, or you can also say Portuguese and Spanish origin. And if I pronounce the word correctly, they are called azulejos. That's the name of the blue tile that you saw. The reason I stressed on that colorful blue tile, the azulejos, is because you'll find a lot of those tiles here in this Latin Quarter of Goa. And of course, you'll see all these bright and beautiful colors as well. The reason this area is called the Latin Quarter of Goa is because Portuguese, the language, and it's also true for a few other European languages, they descended from the language Latin, and that's the reason in a generic fashion you can call these the Latin quarters, but if we were trying to be more accurate, we would call these the Portuguese quarters, because the Portuguese, of course, were ruling Goa for a while. And quite a while it was for Portuguese in Goa here. In fact, Goa had also become their capital for all of the Portugal colonies to the east of Goa. And there you see another azulejos, the beautiful tile. You'll see that those tiles are used in a lot of houses, and right in the front of those houses you'll see the names and the addresses on that tile, the azulejos. I'm sure I'm butchering the pronunciation there, but yeah, it's something like that. Hopefully I'm a little close. But yeah, the Portuguese were here for a long time. That's a Portuguese surname on an azulejos tile. So how long were the Portuguese in Goa? Well, they were here for a very long time. Exactly 451 years, if I got my mathematics right. And for a long part of that duration, Goa was also the capital of Portuguese colonies, as I mentioned, in this part of the world. And of course, that's also the reason why we see so much of Portuguese architecture and Portuguese food and Portuguese influence in this area. So Fontainhas is actually located at the base of a hill which is called the Fontainhas Hill, and that's why you see that elevation in this direction. And on the other side of Fontainhas is actually a small river or creek which is called the Orum Creek. So that's where, between those two things, the Fontainhas location was founded, and it was founded in the late 1700s, early 1800s, and it's been inhabited ever since. Solar Andrade, that's once again a Portuguese surname, and this house is actually a very famous heritage house of this area. In fact, the whole of Fontainhas was declared a heritage zone by the UNESCO. And we can see why this area is considered so special and is considered a heritage, right? It's a very hot and a very humid day today, but still the beautiful old world charm of these houses and of this locality, it's making me feel very happy and very fulfilled in a way. A lot of the people who live in Fontainhas, even today, they are descendants of the original Portuguese who came over and ended up ruling Goa. So you would find that living heritage here as well. Of course, we are all, in a way, living heritage in ourselves. We all have our histories and our long lineages, but when I meant living heritage, I was specifically talking about the Portuguese connection and the connection with the Portuguese colonization, which of course had its negatives, but it also gave us this very interesting heritage. Now we are inside this house, and of course this has to be Portuguese European architecture. And I think colonization, it makes me think of a lot of things. Of course, there was so much negative that happened because of colonization, but I think what I would have liked is the fact that people should have been allowed to travel to new locations and to intermingle, which was one of the side positives of colonization. But in that intermingling, they should not have been allowed to rule or to oppress. That, of course, was the negative. Of course, what we are experiencing today are the positives, I would say, of the Portuguese influence, because you see this diversity of architecture and experiences within Goa. And just to close out on that thought, I feel that foreign presence or the presence of foreigners in a region or even in its administration is not bad in itself, as long as it's just and equitable. It's been a very unusually, or I should say usually, hot and humid day here in Goa. So of course we had to take a break, and because I always enjoy hot drinks, I'm still having this hot cappuccino. And this building, of course, is a traditional Fontainhas building that has now been converted into this nice cafe. Beautiful corridor with a beautiful sloping roof. And of course, if we imagine 100 years back, this probably would have been a place that was inhabited by Portuguese resident of Portuguese Goa. I love how this place has its own character, and that's true with a lot of buildings here. They're not your generic capitalistic cafe or your generic house for that matter. So beautiful. They also look like traditional ceramics from Portugal. They look so much like those azulejos tiles that we saw. Alright, so we will get moving now. This cafe, of course, has been a pleasant pit stop for us, but it's time to get walking. So, the Portuguese first arrived in Goa in the early 1500s. So, if we try to put this place in that timeline, excuse me, we'll realize that Fontainhas is actually relatively new, because the houses and the lanes that you see here, they were actually built sometime in the 1800s, and before that most of this was a wild land. In fact, it had lots of coconut trees. It was like a coconut plantation that was then transformed into Fontainhas. And this happened at the time when the Portuguese were trying to shift the older capital of Goa, which is today's Old Goa, into this place, which is the newer Goa, and this is where Panaji is situated as well. Balcoas, I think that's the Portuguese name of a balcony. And of course, all of this is mostly Portuguese architecture. This one might just be a hybrid of sorts. I see its roof seems very indigenous, whereas the colors, of course, seem very Portuguese, like the rest of Fontainhas. And you'd notice there's also a cross in front of many of these houses, which signifies that the resident or the owner of the house is a Christian. We need to get going now and step out of the Fontainhas area, as much as I would have wanted to explore more. We are trying to get out of the Fontainhas area now, but what you do notice on your left is Cafeteria 31st January, and I wanted to talk about that, specifically the 31st January part of it. So a lot of the streets in Fontainhas are actually named after dates. 31st January, for instance, is an important date for Portugal. I think there was some sort of revolution in Portugal in the late 1800s. That's a pretty building. So yeah, that's why the road is called 31st January Road. So yeah, this is it. I will leave you with these colorful houses of Fontainhas. This is as much time as we could get today to explore Fontainhas, but I think someday I'd like to come back and dive deeper.